what happens with injuries. And so what I was talking to him about yesterday is one of my athletes is actually completing his CA, like the chartered accounting, work as part of his postgraduate kind of accounting stuff. And, he gets really stressed about the fact that he's got these exams, he's got these, and they're quite, from what I've been told, I don't know that much about accounting, but they're quite challenging subjects. And he kind of gets stressed about it. And yesterday he was really saying, I'm really tired, I feel really this. But if we actually looked at his training loads, if we looked at managing those things, we've actually been doing less than what he would normally do, and the intensity's actually been pared back because of the understanding that his body responds really interestingly to that.
Yeah, and look, when we start to think about what's the actual rationale for that, it's not something that's trivial. It's something that's actually quite clear in terms of understanding these mechanisms. And I think too, when we think about non-physical factors, clearly a big one is psycho-emotional stress. And I think we've talked about this before, but one of the other things that's really clear is when you experience or you feel like you're under a lot of psychological or emotional stress, whether that be related to work, whether that be related to family, social factors, whatever it may be, your process of recovery from training is prolonged. And part of that is because of the regulation of your immune system based on your psychological state.
I think people would, they'd probably not argue with this, but they'd be like, okay, well, what are you using to kind of measure that? And interestingly, there's the really obvious one of looking at their demeanor, looking at their performance, seeing what their function is like, how well are they able to then take on new skills or challenges, and that goes down, right? But that's subjective, and that's something that you're observing. The thing that's been really interesting is, I think I've mentioned this before, but with a lot of the athletes that I coach for track these days, I use a system called a Megawave, which is developed in Finland, and it's a great system. The really cool thing is it's become really clear that the correlation between what they're getting in their scores on there, as in comparison to what they're telling me, seems to have really good matching, right? And the most interesting part about it is the worst scores that they get are always or have typically been related to psycho-emotional stress, not from physical stress. They tend to bounce back a lot from, say, high training loads if you give adequate recovery and you've structured your cycles correctly. The thing that seems to prolong poor measures and poor performance and poor reporting of what they feel seems to be psycho-emotional stress.
So I think it's probably worth giving context to listeners. You know much more about it than I do. What does it actually measure?
Okay, so the Megawave system measures a few things, but the key ones that people would be aware of is it uses an ECG strap to kind of get an idea of not only some of the more common measures like heart rate variability. That allows you to obviously get some insight into the function of the autonomic nervous system, whether they're tending to be more towards parasympathetic or sympathetic. It also looks at things like their resting heart rate. It'll give you an idea of, and the way that it does that is by looking at, not only those intervals for measurement of heart rate variability, but actually the shape. I don't understand all of the mechanics of ECG sort of readings, but I was listening, and I think you listened to it as well, the founders of it talking about, and the scientists behind it talking about how they actually, even at one point, they were able to find ECG findings that were, say, quite abnormal and then report it, and that athlete ended up having issues relating to tachycardia and all this kind of stuff.
I actually didn't know it.
It was in one of the talks. He was talking about how actually you actually have a heart issue, and the system picked it up.
Yeah, wow.
It's your rhythms are actually not matching what someone we would expect to be, particularly in the shape of the ECG reading. But essentially, so it gives you all those, the overall system function of the cardiac system.
Yeah.
But for me, working with speed power athletes, that's actually not that relevant. And it's really interesting because, again, in one of the discussions that the founder or one of the founding scientists talks about is in speed power athletes, measuring things like heart rate variability is a very poor correlate of where their training status is at.
But it seems to be much more relevant for your aerobic or endurance athletes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So with your endurance athletes, it's going to give you a really good indication of, okay, the type of endurance work that I'm doing, is it actually having the effect that I want? And is it what kind of, how well are they recovering? And then how well are they able to then be exposed to more stress again? right? But it's interesting because heart rate variability became this thing that everyone measured.
Yeah.
And it's like, it doesn't necessarily give you what you want if it's not suited to the type of activity.
We can actually take that one step